Hey everybody, my name is Adam. This is the second video in our series on layers. Today, specifically, I'm going to be talking about adjustment layers, and I'll take a moment as well to talk briefly about layer effects. There'll be one more video in this installment, and it's going to be on masking, and you can expect that in the next couple days.
Hi everybody, my name is Adam. This is the second video in our series on layers. This video specifically is going to be talking about adjustment layers. I'm going to link to the first video in the description below, and I'm also going to be linking to the next video on masking when that comes out in the next couple days. So adjustment layers are a non-destructive method of making visual changes to your images. So it's basically a way to edit your images. They differ from filters. So in AC/DC, filters are destructive changes, meaning that you're going to go into the filter mode, say like light EQ or something like that, for example. You're going to adjust some sliders, and then you're going to finalize that, and it's going to change the layer you're interacting with. They operate very similarly. The difference is that some filters might have a little bit more options than some of the adjustment layers. But all of the adjustment layers, which is the subject of what we're talking about today, are non-destructive. Let me illustrate what I mean. So in this file we have open right now, it's very similar to the file we had in a previous video. I have my base layer and two image layers here. Now what I can do is I can navigate down to the adjustment layer section, which just is down at the bottom here, and there's this list that we get. So we get things like exposure, curves, vibrance, vignetting, that sort of thing. We can also open up this list actually just by clicking this drop-down bar that's to the right of it as well. And these are all adjustment layers. So to give you an example of what I mean, I'm just going to add a curves adjustment to this image, okay? So I'm going to click on the curves button right here. And what will happen is you'll notice that the curves adjustment layer, which is right here, will pop up on our layer order. So when you're adding an adjustment layer, it's always going to be above the image that you've selected. So in this case, if I've selected image layer 2 and I go to add a curves adjustment, it's going to pop up just directly above that image. There's a good reason for this. I'm actually going to go ahead and delete the second curves right there. The reason for this is because one of the functions that you can change about your adjustment layer is that you can clip them to the image that appears directly beneath it. And so what I mean by that is you can make the choice to apply the effects of the adjustment, in this case the curves adjustment, just to the layer that exists beneath it. Normally, on their own, so if I go to this curves and click on the adjustment itself, and I was just make our midtones darker, for example, this adjustment would be applied to all of the images that exist beneath the curves adjustment layer. And what I mean by that is if I was to take my image layer that exists right here, that's 2 above our base layer, turn it on, and then reduce the opacity, you can see that this curves adjustment is not only affecting our image layer here of the beach, but also the base layer. So curves, okay, when they exist in our layer order, will have an effect on all images that appear beneath them, except for when you use the clipping icon. So if I use the clipping icon on this image, I'm just going to click this right here. The clipping icon is this little diamond that appears to the left of the actual adjustment layer icon. So if I click on that, you can see that this curves adjustment has now been just applied to the image that exists beneath it. So for reference again, all of my adjustments are being applied to this image layer. If I was to take a second curves adjustment, I'm just going to right click this to duplicate it. And I turn off this clipping function. This curves adjustment is affecting the image layer right here, okay? And it's also affecting our base layer right here, which is separate and distinct from the curves that's clipped to just applying its effect to the image layer beneath it. So there's a couple things you can do, obviously. If you want an adjustment to just affect the layer beneath it, you can actually move the adjustment layer to adjust its order in the stack. Or you could just place it on the very top and have its effect applied to all of the images that exist beneath it in the layer order. So I just want to point out the fact that just because, in this case, Just because I have this curves adjustment here doesn't necessarily mean that I want this curves adjustment to be applied to all my images. I can just have it applied to the image that it appears directly beneath it. So clipping is very useful, and you might find yourself using this quite often. In the case of our curves adjustment here, you'll notice that one of our images is hidden. In this case, this image is not visible currently. This curves adjustment, if I click the undo button, or sorry, if I click the clipping icon, this adjustment isn't being applied to an image that is not visible. But if I was to click on our image here, now that it's unhidden from view, we can see this image. Now this curves adjustment is being applied to that image in addition to the other two. So just a note that it's not going to be, because it's not visible, because it's hidden from view, then you're not necessarily seeing the changes that are being applied to that image. Adjustment layers have a couple different buttons on them. We talked about the clipping. The next, obviously, is that you can hide them just the same way you can hide a normal layer. So I can click that on and off to essentially see or hide that effect. If I click on the thumbnail right here, that is the mask in this case, it's going to bring up the mask properties. We're going to talk about masking in more detail in the next video, but I just want to point out the fact that if you click on the masking icon itself, this mask right here, it'll pop up with these mask properties, which is different because sometimes when you click on your layer, you might accidentally click on the thumbnail here, the mask thumbnail, and not realize that it opens the mask properties. So if you're like, whoa, well, I can't, where did my adjustment layer, my curves adjustment layer go? Well, that's just because you need to either click on the curves title itself or click on the icons that's to the left right here. And that will actually bring up the adjustment itself. So in our previous video, one of the things we noted is that when we save our AC/DC file, it contains all of the non-destructive information. In essence, basically, it contains all the changes that we've made to our image. And when I saved my image previously, I saved my image containing this base layer and these two layers above it, and I had made an opacity change, and it saved that. Well, what I want to do now is I just want to showcase if I had added a bunch of adjustments to our image. Let's just add a couple more for good measure. Maybe what I'll do is I'll add a vignette, and I'll reduce the opacity of that vignette. And then maybe above my base layer here, I'm actually going to also add a split tone effect. So I'll click on the split tone button, and I don't know, why don't we make it blue in the highlight, and we'll make it, magenta in the shadows. I just want to showcase that I have a couple adjustments applied here. In this case, we have 3 adjustments in addition to our 3 base layers. If I navigate over to File and Save As, I'm going to save this in that same test folder. The difference is I'm going to go Layers plus Adjustments, and I'm going to save this as a new file. And just keeping in mind that I'm saving this as an AC/DC file format, and this is important because this is going to contain that non-destructive information, so we can edit this file in the future. If I was to save it as another file format, it will flatten our file and combine all of the effects together. So I'm just going to save this layers adjustment here, and it's going to write the file. My point of showcasing this is when I go to re-navigate to this file in the future. So once again, I'm going to go back to manage mode, and let's find a different file in our directory. So just navigate to a different folder, and I'm just going to open up this file, for example, in edit mode. And then what we're going to do is we're going to navigate back to manage mode, and we're going to select that same file that we were interacting with earlier, which is in this test folder over here. I am going to open up the layers plus adjustments, as you can see right here. And when I open this, what you'll notice is that all 3 of those layers will be present. One of those layers will have an opacity adjustment, and all 3 of my adjustment layers are also included in this non-destructive file. You can notice here the opacity is lowered, the curves adjustment, and if we look at the curves adjustment, it looks like, oh, we had just sort of darkened the midtones there, And so that's very clearly those settings are saved. And if we look at our split tone, we can see that the highlights are that light blue color, and the shadows are that sort of magenta color here. So what we can see is that in our combination of files here, with our layers and our adjustment layers, now that information can be saved, and we can sort of bring up this file that contains all these different edits at any point in the future to tweak these adjustments. Which, again, I'm going to showcase this is distinct from actually a filter versus an adjustment layer. So if I was to take my base layer here, and let's just duplicate that base layer, this is maybe a good practice to get into when you're working with filters, because when I go to make a filter adjustment to this base layer versus a adjustment layer adjustment, you'll see that this base layer will be permanently altered. So I'm going to click on this layer, and we're just going to navigate to any old filter. It really doesn't matter to showcase this. Let's just go to Color EQ, for example. So I'm going to go to Color EQ, and I'm going to make some dramatic changes to this image to just showcase what I mean. So let's increase the saturation on this image, and let's maybe change the hue of the sky to green, say blue to green. There we go. Again, this is not a desired change, but it's just to showcase that we've made a dramatic effect here. So I'm going to click Done now that I'm done these filter changes. And you can see that if I actually look at this base layer itself, the base layer contains those changes. So if we're looking at that thumbnail, you can see that that thumbnail is pretty different than our base thumbnail, which means to say that this thumbnail, when I went into that filter adjustment, has destructive changes made to it. One of the benefits of duplicating our layers when we know that we want to go into a specific filter, maybe we really like the light EQ filter, or we really like that color EQ filter, or we really like color wheels or something like that. We want to make a change that's sort of like very easy to do in a filter. Just get in the habit of making a duplication of your image, and that duplication of your image will basically enable you to work as close to non-destructively as possible. So this filter has been applied to this layer, and the only way that I can actively undo that is by going to the history panel and undoing that action. But as soon as I go to save this file as an AC/DC file, keep in mind, as I mentioned in our previous video, we lose that history. So hence the getting into the habit of making a duplication of all the layers we want to make permanent filter changes to. So that filter was destructive. We just did our best to save it on a duplicated layer. But that's very different than our other changes here, which are adjustment layers, and these adjustments are editable at any point. And again, the way that we bring up that editing function is by clicking on the icon within the adjustment or the text itself. And it'll bring up all the settings, and the settings will be at the bottom of your layer panel here, just above the adjustment layers panel itself. Now, there's not really much point in me going into each specific adjustment layer. I just wanted to functionally talk about how they work. There's a variety of different adjustments. The ones that are going to be probably the most useful to you, unless you're making a really complicated sort of like compositional art, the ones that you're going to use the most are things like levels and curves and exposure. I use white balance quite a bit. I use vibrance to adjust different specific colors, that sort of thing. Now, when we go to talk about masking, there's going to be another component that we'll talk about in more depth, which is that each of these adjustment layers comes pre-ready with its own mask, and that mask gives us really, really vast control over what we can do with these adjustments. So look forward to that in the next video. One of the things that we can also do, I'd like to focus on specifically, that it doesn't really pertain to adjustment layers or really layers in general, but one of the things that I just like to highlight is that when we click on, let's make a new layer. I'm gonna go to the very top of my layer order here, and I'm just gonna open a blank file here, or just rather, I'll add a blank layer. And in this layer, I'm just gonna add text. Okay, so over top of our image. So I'm going to click the text tool, and I'm going to click anywhere in our blank layer here, and let's just add some text. And what I can do is, oh, it actually opens up its own layer. That's great. I don't even need the blank layer. So what I can do is I can just take this text and I'm going to adjust the fonts. So we'll change the font. Let's just choose U, and I'll change the weight of the font. I'll just go to regular, and I'll change the color of the font. And let's also, no, the size is fine. We'll just maybe increase, or we'll change the text to say, yeah, layer effect. Okay, so if I have my text layer here, which I will also move, let's just move it to the dead center. And maybe what we'll do is we'll use the align tool to make sure that we get it directly in the center. But once I've done with my text itself, I'm just going to click on the move tool. And the move tool will allow me to center it exactly where I want it to, which is dead center in this case, and I'll just commit that. The reason why I'm creating this text is to showcase these layer effects. So I'm going to take my layer effect layer itself, and I'm going to navigate down to the very bottom right-hand corner where it says layer effects, or the FX button here, and I'm going to click on that. And let's talk about layer effects. So layer effects, like I said, can apply to any layer, but they're going to be most notable on like text layers or shape layers within the center of your image. And they kind of do what you'd think. The classic example, the one that I'll showcase here, is just shadow, which places a little bit of a shadow around the edge of our image here, of which I can change the direction that shadow applies to our layer effect. And then I can also change things like opacity and the distance away from our text and the actual blur itself. So these are useful if you want to just add a further effect, or you want to add some text to your image, but you don't want that text to blend too easily in with the background. Well, you can just go in and you can make a shadow. Or alternatively, we could add another change. We could maybe add like an outline to the edge of our image. So I could reduce the thickness of that, and it has a nice little soft outline that applies to the edge of our image. One of the cool things about layer effects is, once again, they're also non-destructive. So when I go to save this as an ACDC file, I'll be able to open this at any point in the future. I'm just going to close this panel, and you might ask, okay, that's great, Adam, but how do I go about reopening that same panel? What if I want to make a change to that layer effect? Well, you just navigate to the layer panel itself, and up on the far right-hand corner we have that FX button. And if I click on that, what you'll notice is it'll bring up our layer effects in this case, and it will also showcase our outline changes and our shadow changes. So we can always go ahead and re-edit these at any point in the future. You'll also notice that I can actually copy the settings and I can apply it to another layer effects panel. So if I had multiple layers of text or something like that, I could simply copy those, and then when I go to add a new line of text, so go back up to my text tool, and I add new text like this, what I could do is I could take my layer text here, my new text, I can add another FX panel, and I could just paste my changes directly, and as you will notice here, those two pop up with their corresponding values. So I can take those values and I can add them to my layer. So that represents the FX panel. And again, the FX panel, that really just has these 6 adjustments. So inner glow, inner shadow, bevel, outline, blur, and shadow. And the reason why I showcase these in relation to the text tools is because when we went to make our text tools non-destructive within the previous update, we moved all of these effects that were previously only applied as filters into this non-destructive panel that exists on the bottom right here, this layer panel. And once again, things like text layers in this case, they also have that same functionality in terms of opacity and various blend modes that you can apply that we talked about in our previous video there. That's pretty much all I want to discuss in regards to adjustment layers. The big takeaways from this video are adjustment layers are non-destructive methods of making like lighting changes or vignette changes or like levels adjustments or sharpening and blurring, that sort of thing. All of these sort of visual effects can be applied as adjustment layers. And these adjustment layers can be applied to individual images using that clipping function that we mentioned at the start, or they can just be placed above the layers that you want to have their effect applied. On top of that too, we also talked about layer effects and how you can add them to layers. In this case, we showcased that with the text tool.
Hopefully this video on adjustment layers was of some help to you. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comment box below. And then note that our third video will be covering masking more specifically in relation to adjustment layers and regular layers. So you can expect that in the next couple days. Take care.